John Nicholson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow the member for Nottingham North and hear the historical background from his perspective. 2 weeks ago, many of us in this House spoke in a moving debate on the centenary of the Battle of the Somme. Throughout these islands and beyond, the events of 100 years ago were commemorated, and one of the recurring themes here and elsewhere was the importance of treasuring the young lives of our soldiers. When we read about the senseless slaughter on the Somme, we like to think of ourselves as more sophisticated than previous generations and less gullible. We like to think that we're more concerned with the lives of others, be they our own soldiers or civilians abroad. And yet in this House, in very recent history, we voted for a war which was an unpardonable folly. On March the 18th, 2003, 411 MPs, as we've heard, followed Tony Blair into the Yes lobby, unleashing the forces of hell in Iraq. 139 of those MPs are still serving in Parliament today. Now, it must be difficult to live with that vote, but rather than accept personal responsibility, too many say, if I'd known then what I know now, I would never have voted for the war. And I'd like to focus on that because I don't buy it, and I think it's too easy a cop-out. Tony Blair has become such a discredited figure that he's a convenient depository for shared guilt. It was his golden oratory which bamboozled me, say some MPs. The seductive mendacity. Who could have questioned our security services in all their wisdom either? We believed Colin Powell too, with his illustrated talk at the United Nations, with its cartoon mock-up of mobile laboratories and trucks. And we fell for his dire warnings that the secular Saddam Hussein was in cahoots with the fundamentalist Osama bin Laden, however culturally illiterate the claim was. It was all just so convincing, if only we'd known then what we know now. But it's all nonsense, Mr. Speaker. We did know then much of what we know now, and if we did not, it was because we chose not to absorb the expert opinion available at the time. We knew that Saddam Hussein had once possessed chemical weapons. He'd used them in the 1980s. We all knew that, against the Kurds, the Iranians and the Shia. However, we also knew that the implementation of 2 no-fly zones from 1991 until the war in 2003, one in the north of Iraq and one in the south, prevented any further chemical attacks as the chemical weapons could no longer be dropped. Even at the height of his powers, there were limits to those powers. In 1991, 39 Scud missiles were fired at Israel. I was there at the time as a journalist, and they crudely targeted Tel Aviv and killed no one. But even if he couldn't fire his chemical weapons, might they somehow have become a threat in the battlefield? Well, in the aftermath of the invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War in 1990, the United Nations Special Commission on Iraq was set up to inspect Iraqi weapons facilities and maintained a presence in the country until several years later. And there was broad agreement amongst experts that Iraq was not an imminent threat. Those that had been used against Iranian and Kurdish opponents had been destroyed or were degraded beyond use. Let's remind ourselves of what the experts said at the time. Scott Ritter, a United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq from 1991 to 1998, stated in 2002 the following. Since 1998, Iraq had been a fundamentally disarmed country. 90 to 95% of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction capacity had been verifiably eliminated. If Iraq was producing chemical weapons, we'd have had proof, pure and simple. Chemical weapons, the experts told us repeatedly, don't have a long shelf life. Ritter stated that Iraqi sarin and tabun had a shelf life of approximately 5 years. Botulinum toxin and liquid anthrax last about 3 years. So as members debated the war in this House, they knew that at the height of his powers, Saddam had never had the capacity to fire chemical weapons long range. But with years of no-fly zone restrictions and the passage of time, his weapons, even had he had the power to fire them, which we knew he did not, were degraded and beyond use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seem to recall, Mr. Speaker, that the honourable gentleman and myself were both in television studios at the time, and I also seem to recall us laughing at those mock-ups of those vehicles, and we together agreed that if those vehicles existed, you could easily photograph them from the skies, so we thought they can't exist. Why do they need to make drawings of them when they can get photographs of the actual vehicles?
The honourable and gallant member remembers very well we did indeed sit in television studios because we called in experts to ask experts for their evidence. And so it was relatively easy, even as a journalist, to pick apart many of the absurd claims. But of course, some journalists were screaming for war. The Sun ran the absurd headline, "Brits 45 minutes from doom," about a supposed threat to troops in Cyprus. The Star wrote, "Mad Saddam ready to attack. 45 minutes from a chemical war." It was all nonsense. The journalists who wrote it knew that it was nonsense, but it was terrifying for some members of the House. In January 2003, United Nations weapons inspectors had reported that they'd found no indication whatsoever that Iraq possessed nuclear weapons or an active programme of chemical weapons. The International Atomic Energy Agency at the time found no evidence, I quote, or plausible indication of the revival of a nuclear weapons programme in Iraq. And the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission said at the time that they did not find evidence of the continuation or resumption of programmes of weapons of mass destruction. However, Vice President Dick Cheney retorted, "We believe that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein has in fact reconstituted nuclear weapons. I think Mr. El Baradi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, frankly, is wrong." So who are parliamentarians to believe? The chemical weapons experts, the missiles experts, the Atomic Energy Agency, or Dick Cheney, George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld and the neocons? The House had to make up its mind. Now, in the run-up to the Iraqi war, I was working as a journalist, as the honourable gentleman has pointed out, presenting, amongst other things, the 3-hour daily radio news programme. We'd access to experts as any news journalists do. We called them in and asked them to outline their evidence. Now, I'm not a pacifist. I supported NATO action in Bosnia and Kosovo due to the imminent threat of life and the need to save civilians. In fact, I was on the hostage flight back from Iraq, which an honourable member mentioned earlier on. I was with the hostages as they returned, having fled from Saddam Hussein. However, during interviews with experts and academics in the run-up to the House's vote, I saw clearly that the case for war was built on exaggeration and deceit. It was blindingly obvious. Now, Tony Blair frequently told this House and the British people that he was working towards disarming Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. He repeatedly told this House that his aim was not regime change. So the House could have been under no illusion what it was being asked to vote for. Mr. Blair said, "Saddam is a very brutal and repressive leader. However, disarmament of weapons of mass destruction is our aim. It is not regime change. That is not our basis for war." So the challenge to this House on the day of the debate was very clear. Mr. Blair was asking members to vote on one basis and one basis alone: the imminent danger posed by Saddam's weaponry. So what if all the experts talking in public were wrong? Were there any elevated group of experts, an inner core with extraordinary knowledge unavailable to the ordinary expert? Now, members will recall that Tony Blair often said, "If only you could see what crosses my desk, you'd never doubt the danger that we are in and the pressing case for immediate action. Yes, I will.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. And in terms of lessons learned in relation to that, does he share my concerns about recent mission creep and use, for instance, of intelligence-led drone strikes after the event only notified to this House, and what that means for transparency?
I am. I think that I'm not at all convinced, actually, that we've learned the lessons. Many members keep saying we've learned the lessons of war. I'm not convinced. I wasn't convinced that we had when we had our debate on Syria. But Tony Blair made a direct appeal, saying that he was seeing privileged information that no one else was seeing. He asked the House to trust him. And many members have said that appeal for trust was what swayed them. It was a direct appeal to members to ignore the available scientific evidence. But there was one embarrassing hurdle in the way, and that was Robin Cook. I had an extensive interview with Robin Cook after his resignation from the Labour front bench on the 17th of March 2003. I asked him if he saw the same briefings as the Prime Minister on Iraq, and he said, yes, I do. What was it, I asked him, which had crossed Mr Blair's desk, which he couldn't tell us about, but which contradicted all the expert evidence? Robin Cook told me there was nothing. Nothing crossed the Prime Minister's desk that hadn't crossed his as Foreign Secretary, and nothing had crossed his or the Prime Minister's desk that suggested an imminent threat from chemical weapons. He told me that on that basis the war could therefore not be justified. Now, every MP listening to that interview meeting with Robin Cook here in the House, or taking on board the opinion of experts at the time, would have known that the case presented to this House was flimsy to the point of absurdity. Now, I am, of course, aware of the pressure MPs were under. Setting aside their promotion prospects in government, tabloid newspapers had launched a vicious campaign against opponents of the war. The Sun published a traitor's dartboard, something I note that it has since deleted from its website in the aftermath of the Chilcot report. It ran a front-page picture showing a picture of a snake and Charles Kennedy with the headline, "Spot the difference, one a spineless reptile that spits venom, the other a poisonous snake." MPs were frightened that they'd be targeted as cowards and peaceniks. But as we survey the carnage of Iraq, the countless civilian lives lost, soldiers' lives lost, and family lives destroyed, it's easy to look for a single scapegoat. And while I share the disdain widely felt for Tony Blair, there's something gutless about attributing all blame for individual MPs' votes cast to him and him alone. The truth is that expert information was freely available to any member who chose to take it.
Tom Break.
Mr. Speaker, and can I